So hello again, and we have Bob Dignen with us again today for session 6. Now, our topic is
Hi,
how are you, Bob?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. So our session today is email communication. So Bob, what are the best ways to communicate across cultures? People, I guess, interpret emails in different ways, and there's no opportunity for people to actually see each other and express each other in a way that it's done in face-to-face. So email has its challenges. Would you like to talk a little bit about email communication and how the challenges of that?
Yeah, and again, just to come back to the language of the first question, which I think we need to be careful with. You said, what is the best way to communicate? I mean, we probably both agree there isn't going to be a best way, but what we need to pay attention to is a number of dimensions.
Sure.
So I think we should pull out some of those dimensions. You also used the word challenges. I think we also need to be aware that although people complain a lot about email, email is very much here to stay. It's part of the technology. It's part of the protocol of working in global or dispersed companies, even within a single country. So I think rather than wishing email away, we need to understand how to use email effectively. And that means thinking about who we write emails to, in which style we write them, to which level of detail we write them, how often we write them. And those kinds of questions we can answer alone, but you know what I'm going to say, that very often it's best to discuss those kinds of ideas with partners so that you get some kind of clarity over all of those protocols. But in many ways, I'm a great believer in email because I work with a lot of non-native speakers, and the alternative to email is calling somebody on the phone. And many of my clients are like me when I'm trying to speak German, terrified to get a phone call in a foreign language, and actually digesting an email in the comfort of maybe one's own home with time, with a dictionary, and also having the time to construct that message with a dictionary when sending an email. In many ways, it's kind of more optimal than what native speakers might assume is a face-to-face or a telephone call.
Absolutely. Because again, if it's written, non-native English speakers can actually consult with the dictionary if there are words that they can't understand. Whereas if it's face-to-face, they don't have the opportunity to do that. And unfortunately, in some cultures, just nodding and accepting whatever is being said without even completely understanding it is the norm. So
yeah. I mean, it's interesting that email also has those challenges of interactivity, because some people, when they receive an email, they respond back. They say, "Thank you for that email. I'll action it next Wednesday, and if you haven't heard from me by Thursday, I will get in touch, or please you contact me," which is a very explicit form of interactivity. I mean, other individuals, whether it's cultural or psychological, when you email them, it's like emailing into a black hole. You just don't hear anything back. And that causes a lot of confusion and frustration. And I think anybody thinking about their email usage really needs to think not only about the sending of emails, but the responding to emails in order that the sender understands what has happened with that initial email, that it's being dealt with, that it's being understood, and that it's being actioned within a certain time frame.
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right. Even, I guess, within the same culture, that people respond differently to emails. Some will just say, well, I've received it, I will action it. They don't respond back to the sender to acknowledge that they have received it, and they presume that the sender would trust that things will happen. So unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the sender does want to receive a response saying, "Yep, this is being dealt with. It's going to be dealt with at such and such time," and so on.
Yeah, because they're often they are more invisible. I mean, when you talk to somebody, you kind of have a clue from the the facial movement or the body language, although not always, that the message has landed in some way. As you were talking, I mean, one thing I didn't say, which is very critical, is also to consider if you have an urgent demand for information when you send the email. I mean, it's a phenomenon that more and more emails are marked with the word urgent. That's also a symptom of the pressure that people are under, that they don't send emails at the right time. They tend to send emails a little bit late when they really do need the information the next day. And that lands in an inbox where the person has their own priorities. They may even be on holiday. They may just be on a training course and not able to pick up and respond to data because they're in a hotel. And I think thinking seriously ahead about when you might need to send a true urgent email and alerting people perhaps 1 or 2 weeks in advance that email might come, I would also say is good practice and respectful practice to your counterparts.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, yes. So, Bob, would you like to go through some examples of effective email communication?
Yeah, I want to look at an example of an email exchange that highlights many interesting dynamics, particularly of international projects and the attempt to resolve a conflict in some way, a conflict by email. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I need to do is to talk through the scenario and the individuals that we're looking at. What we're going to do is look at an email which Beth sends to Helen. Now on the graphic you see an organigram, and in blue this is a project team. You have a project team led by Manfred, a German guy. Mm-hmm. You have 2 work streams. One is headed by Helen, and she's collaborating with Phil, and they're actually working to transfer a product from the US to Malaysia. So it's a kind of a product innovation transfer, very typical in international projects. Mm-hmm. In a separate work stream, not connected to Helen and Phil's working, is Beth. She's simply working on an IT solution. Now, Beth has a day job. When she's not working in the project, she's actually a very senior manager. She is head of Asia Pacific, and into her reports outside of the project the local line manager of Phil, namely a head of Malaysia, into whom Phil reports. So Beth has a curious relationship with Phil. On the one hand, Phil is part of her region. Malaysia is part of Asia Pacific. So Beth knows Phil and occasionally meets him when she travels to Malaysia. In the project, she has nothing to do with him. She's in a separate work stream. But of course, as she sits in the project meetings and looks at the collaboration between Helen from the US and Phil from Malaysia, she sees problems. She sees it's not working. So what does she do? She decides to write Helen an email. And it's this email that I would like to take a look at now and just read it through. I want you to have a look at it, think about it, and just give me your feedback as an example of email communication. So let me read it through. So it's from Beth to Helen, subject Phil Chu. So, dear Helen, I just got back from Kuala Lumpur where I met with Phil. As Phil's zone manager, I was surprised at how demotivated Phil has become. As you know, he's regarded by me and many of my colleagues in the zone as high potential. He's very polite, but it's clear he's found working with you difficult. I understand the pressure you're under at your end, but I don't think you understand the pressure his boss has been putting on him. We had a long talk about the project, and I think he now believes he can deliver the results you need. I suggest a more supportive relationship will help to achieve this. Regards, Beth. Mm-hmm. What are your first thoughts about that as an example of international email communication? Spontaneous reaction.
I think it's very direct. I guess it's to the point, to a degree where Helen might kind of find it slightly offensive.
That's beautifully indirectly stated. I mean, most people when they read this email, I mean, they're pretty critical. I mean, they don't see it as Beth's job to tell Helen what to do. They see it as personalized. They see it as deeply kind of a critical, offensive, blaming her for the problem. And in general, they say for such a scenario, you should never write an email. You should pick up the phone. And if we go to the next email, you can see that there are risks in this email, because looking at Helen's response, you see the impact of the mail. So it's, "Dear Beth, I was shocked to hear from you. This is the first time during this project you've emailed me, and it's to tell me how to do my job. Phil and I are working to turn around his side of the project, and I don't think your intervention will help. Certainly, I've never been accused of not being supportive. Regards, Helen." And that kind of email out and response back, I think, characterizes a lot of corporate email communication. But I think we just need to take a step back to that original email and just challenge not the writer, but the reader. So I think one of the greatest issues with email communication is that we don't really read them very intelligently. We tend to read emails rather superficially and overly critically. So this is a kind of a training exercise I use in all my classes. I allow participants to criticize the email, which 99.9% do, and then I ask them to think: is that criticism fair? Is that really a fair understanding of what Beth was trying to do? And then I push them back to the email and ask them to find 10 positives in that email. 10 positive things that they can fairly see based on Beth's intention, which they can respect and then possibly respond back to in their email in a more intelligent way than Helen. So let's, through a discussion, maybe pull out 10 positives from this email which don't appear at first reading. So I'll give you the first go. What's the first positive?
So the first positive is that I guess Beth is highlighting how reliable Phil is by saying he's regarded by me and many of my colleagues in the zone as high potential. He's very polite. So he's kind of highlighting, I guess, Phil's positives. So that's one positive, I guess. Would that be right?
Yep. I mean, that's in fact there are 3 or 4 positives in those words. I mean, firstly, yes, there's a positive intention, kind of highlighting Phil's capabilities. There's also, you could argue, a sense of loyalty, which is a positive thing. You know, she knows the guy, she knows that he probably is very capable, and therefore it's a sense of loyalty, a natural human mechanism to put the guy in a positive light. She does other things. She says, as Phil's zone manager, so in other words, what she's trying to do there, I think, is explain that she's writing this email not in a way to step into Helen's role. She's writing it from the position of zone manager. And I think, although it doesn't really come across very well, she is trying to clarify the role within which she's writing in order to respect Helen's autonomy and relationship with Phil. She says he's high potential. You know, high potentials, when they're recruited and trained, you're looking at an investment of about $250,000. So high potentials are very important and expensive entities. Helen may not know that, so it's actually providing quite useful information. Also, the expression of surprise, that's a little bit of emotion coming into the email. Some may see that as unprofessional, and yet statistically you're more likely to build trust with somebody if you're open with your emotions. So maybe that's a little bit the intention, trying to be honest and honest emotionally, not only at an informational level. And maybe also surprised, because she doesn't say, but maybe surprised because she thinks Helen is such an amazing manager. And that's why there is a level of surprise and disconnect. So implicitly behind that word, there may be a compliment.
Absolutely.
So it needs some creative thinking, but once you start working with it, you begin to see, actually, maybe that's what she does mean. And if she means that, it's not so bad.
That's right. I mean, if I guess Beth expects Helen to be an amazing manager, then it is likely that she's surprised that Phil is not motivated. So from that angle, it definitely makes sense. But I guess on first account, when people read that, they don't really see it in that on that light. Kind of it's that our defense mechanism, isn't it? Just plain.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot more there. I mean, she gives quite useful information about Phil's politeness.
Mm-hmm.
Helen comes from the US, a more direct style. She may not fully understand perhaps Phil's quietness and unwillingness to give feedback. Mm-hmm. She doesn't say that Helen is difficult. She says that Phil has found working with Helen difficult. That's a very careful and moderated use of language. She empathizes. She says, I understand the pressure you're under at your end. In all of our discussions, we've talked about empathy as a key quality. But it's interesting. Most readers, when they look at that email, they don't see it. They just see it as lacking empathy and blaming. She had a long talk with Phil about the project. That's interesting. A senior manager having a long talk with somebody relatively junior, a one-to-one. That shows a commitment to people from a regional manager into the locality. That's, again, best practice, I would say. Interestingly, now, she says, I think he now believes he can deliver the results you need. In other words, she solved the problem. So the email reads like an accusation the first time. The second time, we see it as reporting, I've solved your problem for you. But going forward, she gives useful coaching advice, manage the relationship a bit more carefully, because relationships are probably important in Malaysia. So when you pull all of that together, you can kind of say, actually, that's not a bad email.
Absolutely. And I think just to emphasize on the last sentence, it's not it doesn't use directive language. It basically reads as I suggest. So it's a suggestion. It's a recommendation. It's not saying you must, have a more supportive relationship with Phil. So it's I think it's important to kind of highlight that the structure of the email is in fact it's very very well structured. I think.
Yes, and it's interesting you pick out the word suggest, because in first readings in classes, actually participants or students often pick out I suggest as a very direct and ironic and sarcastic way of communicating that Helen must do this. Only on the second reading do they see it as a more neutral and actually relatively professional and open way of simply saying this might be useful, but it's not a must. It's up to you to decide. In other words, it derives from respect. And all of this comes back to so many of the discussions we've had before, that language is inherently incredibly ambiguous, that when we're hearing or reading somebody, we're often not getting their intention, we're getting the what of the message, not the why. And to really fully intelligently decode somebody, we have to go to that next level. You can't really do it in an email. You can't quickly clarify and interrupt and make things clear. So the creative ability of individuals to read emails sympathetically is very, very important.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. So I guess, what would that mean for individuals communicating? And I guess if we look at it both from a sender's perspective and the receiver's perspective, is it more that we need to work on our attitudes, or question our response or our reactions to whether it's email communication or any form of communication? Am I actually hearing what I think I'm hearing, or should I actually question my reaction to this? So is it more that we need to work on?
Well, think about the sender first. I mean, I think the message, although we had to work very hard to get to a positive reading of Beth's email. So I think that despite the fact that we read it positively, I think there are risks in this email for a number of reasons. Firstly, she doesn't really surface a great deal of positivity towards Helen in the email. It's kind of implicit, and I think a lot of the work that I do is really encouraging people to be more explicitly positive in their communications in order to overcome the natural negative bias that individuals have. So, I would recommend starting the email if I were coaching Beth with, "Dear Helen, heard great things about you and the project here, that you're doing a great job in Malaysia with Phil. I just wanted to pick up something which might support you." Mm-hmm. So, positive start. And the other thing I did there was give a positive objective for writing and explain it as support, not critique. And I think those two things alone can transform how people read stuff.
Absolutely.
Positive intention, positive objective. And that's psychologically called priming. Mm-hmm. You actually frame how people read the entire email. Get that message out there early, and I think you solve an awful lot of problems as a writer.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important. As you mentioned, most of us have this natural negative bias towards anything, people in general, and that's it's so hardwired in us because it goes back to our primitive past and the fight and flight response and so on.
Yeah.
So to overcome that natural negative bias, always starting positive, as you mentioned, being maybe thanking someone for something they've done in the past or what they're doing now, how great it is, and so that as you mentioned is the priming aspect, so that you put them in a positive state of mind, or already creating a positive tone to the email, and then moving on to feedback, which they're more likely to I guess accept and digest.
Exactly. I think the other critical thing to add to kind of positive starts and positive objective would be to create a greater level of openness and interactivity within the email. A lot of this email from Beth is pretty much it's statements. It is, and I think if she uses more conditional language, that it might be, it could be, it's just my perspective, I think that makes things easier to digest because it seems less absolutist. And then additionally, it would be interesting just to insert a few questions like, what do you think? Shall we have a conversation about this? Because I think I may be off the mark in some respects. So I think creating openness linguistically and openness from a channel management point of view is very important. I mean, I always recommend that at the end of this email that the person suggests a telephone call, and a very specific kind of suggestion. It would be something like, "I'll give you a call at 3 o'clock tomorrow because I think it would be really interesting to discuss this. If that's not a good time, can you suggest another moment when it's more convenient?" In other words, rather than "if you have any questions, please contact me," which is too open and people won't come back to that, it's actually forcing interaction to happen at a specific point in the future, which might strike some as a little bit manipulative, but I think this idea of forcing interaction, I think, is really goes to the heart of a lot of international communication.
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly important in a call to action to proceed, is a specific time frame is provided. Because as you mentioned, a lot of times is, please call me when you have time or something like that, would generally not be as effective because people are busy and they would get caught up in things. But if there's specific time frames that people can kind of make a decision, then that would be a lot more effective.
Exactly, and of course, a lot of these we're talking in abstract terms. I think it's also important, as with verbal communication, to customize the email style a little bit to the tempo and the temperament of the individual. And one thing I kind of play with after we've worked with this email in class is the fact that Helen and Beth may know each other very well, and Beth may be writing this email in a style totally customized and demanded by Helen. We don't know that. All those first comments for criticism are just based upon our own preferences. They're not actually a neutral analysis of the communication in front of us. And that, again, takes us back to this ethnocentrism, the cognitive bias that we're constantly projecting onto others our needs. And if we're reading an email as somehow negative, just recognize that not as a truth, but as a moment to step away, look at it a bit more intelligently and message back positively. And the clients who are doing that are reporting it's having a really significant impact on their virtual relationships.
Absolutely. And I think going back to what you mentioned earlier on how we interpret things and how there might be a cultural element, we know for a fact that some cultures are more direct, and that's the norm. And some cultures try to sugarcoat, criticism. So if you look at, like, for instance, Dutch culture, I mean, it's very direct, and people kind of tell each other what they mean, and that's not taken as any in a wrong way, or it's not taken personally. So how do we? I guess what the recommendations you made is to always start with a positive, statement, and then move on to the feedback, which might have some negative connotations. Helps in any culture, wouldn't it? You can, whether it's in the Dutch culture or in a Western culture, Eastern culture, that would, I guess, work quite well ubiquitously.
Well, you know what I'm going to say when you introduce universals, I'll always have a story that undermines that, because, I mean, interestingly, you would think that working with positive feedback would be some kind of universal. But I always remember working in a project for a client. It was led by a British guy, used to using lots of kind of sugarcoating positive feedback. And in one of the work streams was a German client who I knew very well. And this English guy, he gave some positive feedback to Gudrun. And over lunch, she came and sat next to me, and she was furious with that. She was furious with the positive feedback. She said, "Why is he giving me positive feedback? Didn't he believe I could do the job in the first place?" So for her, it was somehow an expression. It was an unnecessary. She came from an environment where if you did a good job, you didn't say anything, and that was a sign of respect for the person because you expected them to do a good job. Yes. So this was totally confusing for her, and after a bit of time, we kind of explained it, but it still wasn't her expectation.
That's really interesting, and I mean, it is. I guess it's a little bit outside the topic of our conversation, but I think it's worth exploring because, again, there is a mindset and a cultural element of what people are used to, and I guess if it challenges, like if positive feedback challenges or undermines the person's feeling of competence, or trust in their competence, then that would be seen as in a kind of a, I guess, in the wrong way.
Yeah, but I've had a couple of cases of bosses coming to me and saying they were quite shocked by their team member in early conversations when the team member would say to the boss, "I can do your job," and the boss was very disorientated by that. But in subsequent conversations, that comment turned out to be a compliment because the team member was saying, "You're so great. You should be doing a much more senior job than this. Even I can do your job." So it's very, very difficult sometimes to decode what people are actually trying to say to us, and it's that deep suspicion of language and our own ability to decode it. You need to hold that, I think, when you're working internationally, constantly in front of you, because surprisingly surprising misunderstandings pop up all over the place.
And so I guess to minimize that, misinterpretation, we could apply what we mentioned is really kind of give people the benefit of the doubt that they might mean something else, or questioning our own interpretation and our own judgment. That probably is the only remedy, really, because we'll always have challenges in communicating, and we may misinterpret other people's comments based on our, negative bias that it's inherently in us.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to that very good general point, I would try to encourage a more focused learning approach by people when they're using email in a professional context. And the way to do it is when you send an email, look very, very closely at what comes back. Because if what comes back is not what you expect, or it's not fully aligned to the orientation of the sent message, that for you is a feedback that what you sent needs to be improved next time. And until you are receiving emails which absolutely meet your expectations, it means you're failing somehow in the sending. So to use the emails you're receiving not as a source of frustration, but as a source of learning, every day all those emails you're getting are telling you how good a communicator you are. I think if you adopt that kind of attitude to the emails that are coming in, it makes them more fun, it makes it more interesting, and it makes you improve. So that's you've got the opportunity to learn on a daily basis. All you've got to do is read the emails a bit differently.
Absolutely, and I think that's a fantastic approach, which does require a level of self-reflection.
Oh yes, and self-control.
And self-control. Bob, thank you very much again for session 6, and we look forward to our next session.
Okay, thank you. Look forward to talking next time.
Thank you, Bob. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.